And with that, I am happy to introduce our next topic, because it's a topic that really relates to each and every one of us, and that is happiness. Because what is a life without a quest for happiness? And how often do we actually ponder on the thought of happiness? And it shows in recent decades that happiness is really correlated and linked to our overall health. But how do we acquire it? What do we do? And what does it actually signify? Well, luckily we have a speaker here who really has a lot of knowledge and insight into this topic. He was on the main stage, maybe you heard him, but he's now going to come here and dive a bit deeper into this topic. And I'm of course talking about Svend Brinkmann, who is a psychology professor at Aalborg University and really specializes in the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and also cultural analysis. And I'm sure many of you also have seen or heard him in his radio show, Brinkmanns Briks. He's going to be here on stage in a live podcast together with Mats Menke, who is one of the initiators of Copenhagen Health Week. So please give it up for Svend and Mats.
Thank you.
So we just passed 11 o'clock, so we can still say, I think, good morning or good noon.
We can indeed.
We can
Morning.
indeed. So actually one of the things I was curious to ask you, now that we're talking mental health, we're talking happiness, just being able to host an event like this in these ages, and probably wouldn't be 5 years ago, what development do you think in our awareness about our own happiness, our own mental health, has grown in the past since you started working with psychology?
Well, happiness has become a grand topic. It used to be a fringe topic in psychology, something you could maybe specialize in if you had that interest, but it wasn't a big thing. That began to change in the early 2000s, particularly with the advent of positive psychology. Which is sort of an area of psychology that I have an ambivalent relationship with. Maybe we can return to that, but I think that they deserve credit for really focusing on not just human misery, not just on symptoms of ill mental health and disorders. I mean, that's what psychologists traditionally did, but also on human happiness, on flourishing, on the good life, on strengths, and so on. So yeah, maybe 20 years ago, it really began to emerge alongside the cultural development, where more and more people became interested in, well, in a way we've always been interested in happiness, but maybe we became interested in happiness in a new way. The whole wellness wave also began to roll. Scores of books came out about how to become happy, how to optimize your mental health.
I think this was the era about where mental well-being, like people like Tony Robbins became coming out, the whole coaching environment, how to become more, was probably also one of the waves that kind of continues, like,
absolutely,
how can I be more for myself?
Yeah.
And maybe not like a different societal perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of critically interested in this development. I think it has its positive sides, because some of it certainly helps people. But I also see it as a symptom of an individualization process that is going on, where we tend to focus on what I can do for myself, as you say, and maybe less on what we can do together, collectively, to develop good communities, a good society, and so on. Interestingly, when Martin Seligman and a few colleagues initiated this positive psychology wave, if that's a wave too, I guess it is, they said we need to focus on several things. We need to focus on character strengths and virtues. I mean, what does it mean to be a good human being?
Yeah.
We need to focus on optimal experience, positive emotions, and so on. And the third dimension is good society. So originally, they had this broad view of what it means to be happy and what it means to thrive. It's not just about feeling good. That's one dimension. It's also about being a good human being, maybe also in an ethical sense. And it's about having a good society with good relationships and communities and so on, good institutions, democracy. And I think we have focused too little on the third aspect.
So like contributing.
And when I say we, I mean the discipline of psychology. We have mainly catered to people's need for individual self-improvement, which is certainly legitimate. I mean, I'm not denying that, but I think it risks becoming this individualized hunt for personal happiness at the cost of a larger view of the cultural context.
Yeah, but do you see this as kind of like a societal problem? It's something that we also see people are individualizing themselves, they're more focused on inner growth, they're actually the ability to focus on relationships, whether it be romantically or in the workspace. Are we actually becoming more and more anti-socialable?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's also a big one and difficult to answer because how do we measure that? I mean, we know that if we look at what people spend their time doing, then for the past 20, 30 years or so, people work more or less as much as they used to. Maybe they work a bit more because they can also work from home in many sectors. People, grown-ups, adults, parents, spend more time with their children now than they did in my childhood. But what we do less is hanging out with friends, civil society engagements, I don't know, sitting on a school board and so on. We do that less and less. And that's, community building that is perhaps hurt by this. So
you're not getting the feedback either, I guess, right? From peers. If your feedback is from a hierarchy, like in a corporate environment, and from your children, you're probably lacking that peer, I guess, feedback that is also a part of your, let's say, mental development and mental feedback. That you're coming as the specialist. Are we becoming more and more not aware? Let me rephrase that question. I believe that a lot of people that feel that they're alone with their feelings and emotions and ideas, are we actually able to create the environments where we can share these with our peers, or is that why we see an increase in people looking to get help to improve their mental health, whether it be through psychology or psychotherapy or whatever it may be?
Well, the way I see it is that I don't think we have ever spent as much time as we do now on sharing our emotions, sharing our vulnerabilities, sharing our experiences. We do that, personally, people go to therapy and so on. Denmark has the largest number of psychologists per capita in the world.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's just a thing. I'm a psychologist. I educate them at university, so for me it's probably a good thing because we have lots of students. Well, apart from Argentina, actually, I should say, they have the largest number of psychologists per capita, but Denmark is number 2. And we have, online communities where people can join and talk about their problems. That there are fora for, almost anything. So I don't think the problem is, even though you often see it, we need to break the taboo. We need to be able to share our feelings and experiences. I think we do that to a really large extent. And I'm not going to say that we do it too much, but, well, maybe I am. No.
But are we doing it incorrectly?
Maybe that's more like it. I'm on thin ice, I admit, because it's really difficult to say something about it in general. Because on the one hand, of course, it's a human need to be recognized, to have someone witness your problems and talk about them.
To be seen.
Yeah, exactly. obviously, that's a basic human need. And there should be spaces for that. But on the other hand, if your whole attention in your life is constantly directed at yourself, how you feel, then you become self-obsessed in a way, in a bad way. And some of the most interesting psychologies and therapies coming out now are actually about helping people focus less on themselves. We used to have, psychoanalysis and cognitive therapy and humanistic psychologies. They were about becoming yourself, listening to yourself, finding yourself, looking within. And now we have metacognitive therapy and
think less, live more.
Yeah, look less at your own inner self or whatever, and try to engage with life outside yourself more. I have no stocks in any of these therapies. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but as someone who tries to observe cultural tendencies, I think this is definitely a clear one, which is interesting.
So the increased focus on mental well-being, the dark side of that is if everything is about trauma and everything is about digging into something deep, we're staying in a, environment where it's actually unhealthy for us, instead of focusing on the life is out there. I also know you wrote a book called We Are the Life We Live.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe also focuses around the subject.
Yeah, I mean, the point of that book, it's basically a narrative of an elderly woman. I think she's 98 now. She's really an old woman. And she told me her life story, and I tried to interpret what has happened to her. Many things happened to her, but in light of, psychological theory and philosophical ideas, tried to generalize from her lived experience. And the point of talking about we are the life that we live is to say that who we are is not just some inner hidden something that we need to unfold with the help of a life coach or a therapist or a self-help course. We are simply the life we live. And that involves other people. It involves activities, communities, and many things that are outside ourselves. And we need to take all that into account if we need to understand a person. And what we have done in psychology is often to isolate a person from all those things. But then it's no longer really the person. It's an abstraction that we study and that we deal with in therapy.
So kind of like studying an animal, you need to study it in its right environment.
Exactly. Yeah. Like if we want to understand bonobos or you can know something from looking at caged animals in a zoo, but you can know much more about what they're capable of if you look at the lives they live in their context outside the zoo. So yeah, absolutely.
Bringing the topic back to happiness, I mean, we have for many years as Danes been looked at as one of the happiest countries in the world. Do you share that opinion?
Yeah, but with the caveat that it all depends on how we define happiness.
Okay.
But I don't deny, I don't reject these studies that come out that show, I actually had a study in my talk showing that Danes are number 2 after the Finns, so Finland and Denmark and then Switzerland and Norway and so on. If we're not number 1, then number 2. Sometimes it's Norway, sometimes it's Finland, sometimes it's Denmark. I think that's true according to the measures and the definitions of happiness that they employ.
And what are those?
Well, it's a bit technical, but they mainly define happiness in terms of how people understand their life situation. It's a guy named James Cantrill. He invented the Cantrill ladder. And they basically ask you, if your life were a ladder with 10 steps, and step number 10 is the best possible life you can imagine for you, and the first step is the worst possible life you can imagine, on which step do you stand? And we stand in Denmark very high up on that ladder. And we do. I mean, it's undeniable that we have a well-functioning society relative to many other countries. We have a welfare state, unlike many other countries. We don't have huge climate catastrophes yet, like they do in other, and so on and so forth. We don't have a civil war. I mean, so even though we sometimes feel miserable, we know that we are high up on the ladder. We know that we have a good society, and that's what we measure using those approaches. But there are other ways of looking at it where it doesn't perhaps look so bright.
Okay.
You can look at other measures like levels of stress, mental disorders.
Yeah, because that's funny. Because if we look at like mental health in corporate Denmark today, it's. I'm not saying it's borderline pandemic, but it's one of those areas which has increasing focus. So how does that? I mean, how do we correlate mental health and happiness? Because we're talking about being a happy country, but we are seeing more and more people who are miserable, who are depressed, who are feeling lonely, who are stressed. So what part of do you think our society is in discrepancy with the measurement of happiness?
Yeah, the interesting thing I think is that using this method that I just referred to actually makes it possible for you to feel stressed out, maybe even have anxiety issues or depression, and still be high up on the ladder.
Okay.
Because you could still think, well, I live one of the best possible lives. I have everything. I have a family, I have a job, I have a car, I have health insurance, but I feel miserable because I'm much too busy at work or whatever. So it doesn't really measure that. So that's why we need to go to other kinds of studies to figure out how we feel concerning these mental health matters. And they are not that bright. I mean, more and more people seemingly feel stress. More and more people report that they have ill mental health. More and more people use pharmaceutical drugs. More and more people get pensions because they are sick.
Yeah. Worn out,
burned out. So is the glass half full or half empty? It depends on which study you consult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's also why I think it's interesting is if you say it's happening around 20-something years ago, don't you feel that whole journey has been rapidly increasing with your experience, that it's really going fast from 5 years back of talking about, so they're way more focused on it, there are more authors, we're now having podcasts on mental health, it's really something that's focused on. So back to that whole story about how do we correlate those things, and actually maybe the better question is, if I ask Svend Brinkmann, what would you assess we should do differently if we need to focus back on our happiness and maybe combat the problem that we're seeing of a lot of people with poor mental health?
I mainly work with social psychology and cultural psychology, societal psychology. I think we could move enormously ahead if we eliminated child poverty, for example, concerning mental health. I think that would be much more useful than teaching people, I don't know, some cognitive techniques to do something. I mean, well, ideally we should do both. But I think we talk too little about what we can do as a society. I think we should have, better daycare institutions with more adult personnel with relevant education. I think we should have better schools with less testing, maybe less screen time, and so on. I mean, looking at the context, how can we, because people tend to react to the context they're in. I mean, psychology can be a difficult science, but it can also be something that's not really a rocket science. When people feel bad, it's usually because they're in a bad place. So rather than teaching them how to stay in a bad place by making themselves mentally strong or something, I would rather develop better places to stay in. But it's not an either or.
Oh no.
I mean, I think in order to change society in a productive way, in a good way, it might certainly also be relevant to help individuals cope,
Yeah.
so they can go out and actually do something.
Yeah. But I think that was also
Yeah.
what I was trying to reflect upon. If the speed on which we develop as people over the last 20 years and society as well, are we actually able to keep up with the development? Another topic now, you talk about the environment we are in and schools, and now you talk about screen time. Are we actually also, in some senses, fighting a hard battle with what the environment we are in? I mean,
Yeah.
so dopamine levels through screen time, the access to whatever, what do we call it? We kind of suppress how we feel because we can constantly be entertained in some way. So are we actually able to thrive in the society we're creating with big tech and everything that's around us, where we can constantly be nurtured on like a mental dopamine level? We're actually not able to feel ourselves.
Well, that's a very good point you're raising. And, you know, if people feel bad and we teach them that's because there's something wrong with you, they just increasingly blame themselves and feel even worse. So if we taught them instead and taught ourselves that if we feel bad, it might be because we're in a bad place. So let's try to change the place together. Then we could stop blaming ourselves individually for all our miseries. Sometimes, of course, the individual is to blame and the person can do something, but very often it's about larger issues and a larger context. I'm just reminded when you said that about, I was reminded of a book that's 20 years old now, translated into Danish, so you can read it in Danish if you can read Danish. It's called in Danish Valgfrihedens tyranni, and it's written by Barry Schwartz, professor from Swarthmore in the US, and it's called The Paradox of Choice in English. But tyranny, the tyranny of choice, is really the Danish title. And he sort of collects all the evidence, and there are many studies in psychology that demonstrate that whenever we give a person more things to choose from, we increase that person's misery. Because the person will maybe choose this, but know that I could have chosen this or that or that or that. You know. So I talked a bit about FOMO, the fear of missing out, in my talk. And this is really a machine of FOMO that we're developing. Yeah. And this was before social media. This was before smartphones. Yeah. And now we have even more. It's so
almost exponentially.
I think I know I mentioned the term screen time, but I think that's not a very nuanced way of looking at it. It's not the screen, and it's not even the time you spend on the screen. If you could immerse yourself in, I don't know, language learning, or, you know, these apps exist and some of my kids use them, then it would be fine. No, it's the generation of FOMO, of I could also choose this, I could also do that. And if you have that all the time going on in your mind, then it's a huge problem. And it's really fascinating because most of us intuitively think that a good life for a human being is a life with more choices. And that's why we, in a democratic society, a liberal society, like to expand people's possibilities of choice all the time. But the psychology behind all that is the opposite. And some of the studies are really basic. You know, there are famous studies that are old now, but about, you know, people make marmalade or jam and they sell them at some market in the US village, and people come, and if they can choose from, I'm just making up, I forgot the exact numbers, but let's say there are 3 kinds of jam, and people pick one. And they are generally quite happy with the one they picked. There were 2 others that they didn't pick. But if they choose from 30 different kinds of jam, they're not very happy with what they choose, because there were 29 other kinds that they didn't get to taste or didn't get to buy. This is just an innocent example of marmalade. But this is the society we're generating. You know,
Yeah, so actually
thousands of possibilities all the time.
So actually the next generation of young people coming out now, their opportunities and possibilities can actually end them up being indecisive.
Yeah.
Because there's actually too much to choose from. And what if I choose wrongly?
Exactly. And this is how we have reformed our educational institutions as well. Choose this or that, and you know,
and as fast as you can.
As fast as you can, and it's not very healthy, and it's even worse because it's in many ways just an illusion of choice. I mean, our kids learn that they can choose between this and that and this and that, but in reality, they really cannot, because they are sort of directed and managed and geared by all sorts of things. They don't have equal access. They don't have the same resources. So if someone is from a well-off family, sent to a good school, and that person has many more things to choose from, because in reality,
his foundation.
It's a foundation. Yeah, exactly. So not only are we sort of teaching them an illusion, but we're teaching them an illusion that they blame themselves from not being able to live up to. So it's toxic in a way.
Yeah, and we see it more and more with like people now in their early 20s of also a new phase, or not a phase, a new almost population of young people who are now facing problems with their own mental health. And what is a new topic, not to pick like buzzword, what is my purpose? Are we chasing too much purpose? Or where should we chase our purpose?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I thought when people began to talk about purpose that it was a huge improvement. It's much better to talk about purpose, I think, than talking about sort of individual happiness or well-being or
back to contributing.
Yeah, back to contributing, back to meaning, back to something larger than yourself. We know that these are really important existential issues for human beings. But like with anything, the rhetoric, the discourse can become less and less helpful if you chase it.
Yeah.
Constantly. So if everything is suddenly about purpose and you wake up in the morning, what's my purpose? Then it's likely to be a really tough day. But maybe it's better than waking up and asking, how can I become happy today? I don't know. Yeah, my own philosophical hero is Aristotle. And he said that virtue is always found in the middle, the mean between the extremes. And I guess you could say that about purpose, that if you never talk about it, it's a problem. If you only talk about it, it's a problem. But if you talk about it sometimes when it's relevant, then it's probably a good thing.
Yeah. You mentioned before about looking at your own environment. We're closing in on the last minutes of the interview. What are the things to the people sitting in the audience listening now that if they're looking at their own happiness, what are the kind of things you would suggest them to look at? Is like, if I have bad relationships, maybe clean up my relationship. If I'm unhappy in whatever, what are the kind of key things that you would focus on? One thing like this I maybe need to consider removing, and these are the kind of the things I need to focus on.
Yeah. I ended my talk actually with a couple of lists, things to do, things not to do. There were so many things on those lists. If I should boil them down to just one thing, I would say that, and I know this is a really, I don't know, I'm already getting tired of myself just preparing to hear myself say this. But in a way it's very trivial and it's also very cheesy. But the most important thing is trying to make others happy. I mean, if you do that, you'll become happy yourself. But I talked about the paradox of happiness, that if you begin to make others happy because you want to become happy yourself, then it doesn't work.
No, that's not
true
true altruism.
A genuine wish to be there for the people who are important in your life, to contribute, to be a good citizen, big and small. You know, a good parent, a good friend, a good colleague, a good citizen. Those are tasks of our lives that are enormously important. So the way to become happy is to think less about how you can become happy and think more about how you can make others happy.
So that should be our true.
I know it's cheesy, I'm sorry, but it's short, at least.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your insights. It's been
Thank
a pleasure having you on the stage today. We have our moderator coming up and closing off the scene. And thank you to the audience for listening in. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.